thank you to organizers for having me here. And maybe it's also a moment for a brief statement about my own position. As Jacek mentioned, I am director of the State Ethnographic Museum in Warsaw. The museum that was, please have a seat, Corinna and Łukasz with me, and I hope that that our colleagues are still online with us, so we can also ask them questions. Oh, I can see Hilary and Paul. Great. So Łukasz mentioned Corinna and Łukasz, actually, they both mentioned the ethnographic part of Klaatsch collection that is now in State Ethnographic Museum in Warsaw. This part of collection is removed from the exhibition. It happened in 2012, as Łukasz mentioned, and I'm not sure what was the exact circumstance for this decision, but there was a review of this exhibition by Andrzej Turowski that was published in Gazeta Wyborcza newspaper. And this critique was not only about the Australian collection, the way of presenting of this collection in the Ethnographic Museum in Warsaw, but it was also about the African part of the exhibition. I'm not sure if it was a gesture of a kind of censorship, let's say, because African exhibition that you can visit in the Ethnographic Museum at Kredytowa Street in Warsaw is also very problematic, and objects such as Benin bronzes, which provenance is not clear, today are on display. So of course, museum staff is aware of these sensitive issues that are connected with some human remains in our collection. Not many of them, fortunately, but still objects that need some attention from our part. And also, there is another problem that we started to work with. We started meeting with interested communities or implied communities, as Łukasz called it after Erika later. We met some friends, I would like to call them, from African diaspora to discuss the problems that are connected with African exhibition in our museum. So next year, starting from February, we will start a program of exhibitions, meeting, discussions, and also conferences that could be called or framed as decolonial. For us, it will be a moment of self-reflection about our collections, provenance of objects, but also, that is very important, the way of displaying them. What will be the effect of publishing and discussing all these issues? Perhaps some claims for restitution or repatriation will appear. But what is at the moment even more important for us, it's a change of the way of exhibiting and narrating these objects, because I believe that in many Polish museums, the restitution and repatriation will be a new problem, a new issue that we will have to find a solution for. But even if all the objects that should be restituted because they were stolen or acquired in not ethical circumstances, all human remains that should be repatriated, even if all these things and processes will happen, possibly, I hope, in near future, it doesn't mean that our museums will be decolonial or decolonize. What is the main problem in Polish museums, to my knowledge and my observation and interpretation, is the narrative that is very often harmful, injustice, and full of stereotypes. So I would also like to emphasize, after Corinna, that today's meeting, in my opinion, is very exceptional. It's unique, and it's the first event, to my knowledge, the first such an event in Poland, when we can discuss some problems not very obvious and not really known to us, connected to the Eastern European colonization processes and entanglements. They are not obvious and not really well researched until today. And I don't think about history, because I think that historians wrote really a lot about Polish colonial pasts and implications and entanglements, but I think about museums and museum collections. So it's a new topic. And I think that having today these three perspectives, Australian perspective, German perspective, and also Polish one, to discuss in this room is something very new and groundbreaking. So thank you again to organizers of this event, because it's really very, I think, very important to have this discussion. And in my observation, these papers today were actually addressing two main issues. One was the issue of repatriation, the importance of repatriation, that was defined as a very important, long and difficult process that is inevitable in a way to reconciliation. So that was one point important in Hilary's, Naomi, and Sarah presentations. And the second problem was the problem of history and legacy in Australia, in Germany, and in Poland. What does it mean? The existence of this collection, its history, but also its post-war existence and condition, and very turbulent history of the collection that was shared between several Polish museums. So my question in this first issue of repatriation would be, because it's a long process, after these three presentations, I am more aware, I hope we all are more aware, how complex and long-term process it is. So that would be my curiosity to hear more about all these things that are before the actual repatriation, before something really happens and human remains are coming back to their countries, to their homes. I would like to hear more about this research process, but also establishing the relation between, like this case of Gracie Museum was very interesting to me. So perhaps you would like to elaborate more on this process. And in terms of the history and legacy of these collections, especially Klaatsch collection, I would like to ask a question perhaps to Paul, Corinna, and Łukasz, but you can respond to my questions as you wish. But I would like to hear more about the use of this history, what this history and legacy means for the future. How can we use it? Because if hopefully human remains are repatriated, we are still here in our museums with these problems that are not disappearing that easily. So how can we make a use of this lesson of history? That would be my second question. Corinna would like to respond.
Okay. Thank you very much for your very interesting and inspiring points. I think it's very important to have a very careful and patient provenance research before repatriation, because according to the Klaatsch historical documents, I think we will be able to say a lot, find out a lot, where these human remains actually came from on a case-by-case assessment. That's very important. Every individual is unique, and it's not just a whole lot. You know, Klaatsch traveled a lot, and the human remains from all over the place. So it's very important to investigate each single skull or skeletal part and find the right historical documents for them. So to know in order to know whom to give them back. And this brings me also to the fact of the cloth or Klaatsch or Ross collection, sorry, with the K's and the R's on the skulls. Well, I've seen all skulls and I made a photo documentary. All of them have numbers, plus most of them have a K and only a few have an R. And there's also one case who has a K and an R, and it was definitely dug out by Klaatsch in August 1906 in a Sydney suburb called Como. So what we have to find out is where these R comes from. And as far as I spoke to Paul, he says these R's are not Ross handwriting, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So we have to do this very carefully. If it happens that Klaatsch, in fact, did have some skulls in that Roth acquired in the first place, then be it so. But it doesn't change the fact that they have to be given back. So.
Thank you. Perhaps
could I
Paul
just
would like to respond?
Yeah, just very, very briefly. I mean,
we can hear.
Sorry, is that better?
Yes,
that's okay. Okay, yeah, I would heartily endorse what Corinna has just said. There's necessary work that needs to be done, and it may well be that it's a fairly exhaustive and long process. I mean, one of the things which is the most essential thing of all is ensuring that old people, ancestors, go back to their community. And in my experience, there's been at least 3 examples where assumptions have been made about the provenance of an old person, and it's proven to be wrong. And in one instance from Western Australia, from the Kimberley, ancestors who were acquired with the involvement of missionaries were very nearly sent back to the wrong community. And there was a case in Vienna here where it ended up with the delegation arriving only to be given further information which proved quite clearly that these ancestors were destined to go back to the wrong community, which is the worst possible thing that could happen. The second point that I'd make very, very quickly is that if we're going to talk about decolonization, then quite clearly what we're talking about is land, the restoration of ancient sovereignty in the Australian context, and without recognizing that we're not doing the right thing. The tendency has been for repatriation to be a government-to-government process. Now, that has its advantages in as much as it provides resources for elders and other significant persons to be involved in repatriation, to go to museums, to talk to people, to prepare old people for the journey home. But ultimately, there's nothing to stop museums from talking directly to communities. And in many respects, that's a much better approach. I mean, I think Birgit Scheps at the Grassi Museum is a shining example of how things really should be done. In as much as the museum has been reaching out to communities, engaging with communities, talking with them about how a process of repatriation should occur, and in the most culturally appropriate way. Neil Curtis at Aberdeen University, same thing, being proactive to talk to communities and to develop a relationship, which in the process, as the Grassi Museum again exemplifies, can start a new relationship which ultimately leads to new ways in which collections, which communities may be happy, ethnographic collections, they may be happy to continue to be in the care of the museum, that this starts a new relationship where people can talk about, share their culture on their own terms. And this is something that's very important. When government-to-government things tend to happen, there is a nasty tendency for the assumption to be that once the repatriation has taken place, that's the end of it. You know, that things are resolved. Well, it's not. We can talk about numerous examples of where there are still complexities for people to work through, both on the side of museums and communities. But ultimately, if this is to be done the right way, it seems to me that it's best done by a conversation between the museums themselves and the communities whose culture, whose old people they may well have. You do not necessarily have to wait for government. And there are complications when this becomes a government process. Yes, it may provide resources, but at the same time, it can be culturally very problematic and can risk the failure to open new opportunities for dialogue, which will be for the benefit of museums and people in Europe generally.
Like to respond?
I would like to ask a question myself. Does anyone in this room or anyone in Australia know if there is an official request by the Australian government to the Polish government about this collection? So nobody knows.
If I can say, am I muted or not? You're good, Sarah. Yeah, well, as far as I know, there is some dialogue. That's all I know. I have asked about it because I wanted to know, and was told that it's definitely a government-to-government situation. But this is the first time I've actually been able to have any kind of inkling of who might talk to. But I would just want to say a couple of things. One, I absolutely agree with Corinna that we have to do you have to put the effort into the research to match up the documentation with the collections that you have, particularly to know the history of where the collections went. That was one thing that Naomi mentioned in her talk, that they were very grateful for being able to be shown where the ancestors had been taken and stored, and the different conditions and situations that occurred. So the actual journey of the ancestors was really important to the people. So that whole research around where they've been stored and where they went and why they went there is really important part of the story. I then agree with Paul in the discussion about the relationship between the institution, as the museum, and the people that the groups that the ancestors belong to. I think it's really important. Definitely has to be a government response because our funding comes from the government. The government delegations are minimal. For our situation, they only allowed funding for one person, and that was not considered culturally appropriate. In all the situations that we've been involved in, we've always sent at least one other person, but that's a very minimal kind of approach. People wanted to send more, but they, sometimes you don't find out about these things till very late. If I hadn't spoken to Birgit Sheps, there's no way I would have known about the remains coming back from Grassy until I think they arrived in Australia. We were very late to know about the situation. And yet that's such an important story for the Yari people, because it totally confirmed the involvement of women in the blackbirding era, or the free diving era, the naked diving era that they talk about. I mean, legally 1871 was when it was supposed to have stopped. Well, these remains turned up in 1895, 20 years later. So that information is really important, and so, you know, and that came through Virgit's work. So, you know, anyway, I just want to say that idea of, you have to have both. You have to have the government involved, but the relationship with the institutions and the community is really, really crucial to the final outcome of the whole process. It is a process that evolves over time.
If I can jump in for a moment, there is a discussion that has started some time ago, from what I understand, then was dropped and restarted and dropped and restarted. It seems to be, as Paul mentioned, in other contexts, culturally problematic on both sides, with various stumbling blocks and various concerns from both sides, which I try to approach just to leave it within their kind of capacity to sort out situation. And it was so inspiring to hear from the panelists that I think Paul mentioned that museums should talk directly to communities and be proactive. Maybe that will be more promising. But if I just might to add kind of a broader comment from my position and work at the Centre for European Studies in Australia, I can say, and this is beyond our discussion in a broader context, I can say that there is insufficient interest of governments to build a really effective relationship, and particularly on complex and sensitive issues. And I think as researchers, we should work on building this interest, providing reasons to engage and educate. I'm sorry for this kind of appeal, but I do see it on various kind of topics and in different contexts. And I think here we just have another one, extremely important, urgent and sensitive. And the result of that is that we still are where we are. Thank you.
Thank you. Łukasz, would you like to respond?
The repatriation process is crucial, I believe, involving communities, involving maybe politicians, but it's also like I agree with Magda. It will be a starting point for decolonizing of Polish museums, not only in this case, not only in case of Klaatsch collections, because such collections which are entangled with colonial paths and difficult heritage are various, and there are many of them in Poland. The thing responding to your comment on identifying markers, I also don't believe that R on the skulls and in the inventory is an initial of Walter Roth, because some questions could arise, like why did Roth decided to share his collection with Hermann Klaatsch, and how it happened possibly that Roth allowed Klaatsch to move this collection outside Australia. So I didn't use this contradiction in sources to say that the story written in personal documents you have in your collection, in your archive from Klaatsch family are not true. It's rather to find the contradictions between sources, to to interpret them, to lie them each other. But the case that this, let's say, funny case of misnaming the place where the skulls were hidden during the war, which occurred to be Siedlęcin, not Bobrowice, is an example how limited was our knowledge, the professional knowledge and public knowledge about the history of this collection before the war, during the war, and after the war. So coming back again to you and your question about the history of collections, history of museums, and history of science as human practice, like Professor Turnbull already said. It is needed for general public. I advocate for it, but also it is strictly important for provenance research, also to reconstruct the whole story, because between the death of Hermann Klaatsch in 1916 and the end of the Second World War in 1945, there was almost 30 years of having this collection in German collections in Breslau, but without Klaatsch as a protector, because Klaatsch was dead. And also a period between 1955, when Halina Milicerowa wrote her book on Crania australica, and your, Professor Erckenbrecht, research in the years of 2000 and in the last decades. There is also a lot of time in which many things could have happened. We know from other sources and from other cases that objects or even human remains which were perceived as former German property were neglected. Some of permanent markers in museums were even erased and or changed. So the R in this inventory list and on the inscribed on skulls is still something to be unpacked and to make research on. And coming to the last point of the public history of these collections, I believe that after the repatriation process happens, the museums, the Museum of Man, if this museum will happen to open its exhibition again, and the State Ethnographic Museum in Warsaw, should tell this story without human remains on the exhibition and without objects on the exhibition, maybe, because maybe cultural objects will be also the part of the process of restitution. But they should tell the history. And it's even yesterday at the public debate, which was the accompanying event to this conference, we were talking how to deal with the difficult past. And I believe that there's always a question if we should remove something or transform something. It was Lynn Meskel, an anthropologist and archaeologist, who defined negative heritage as something that could be erased, even by destructing it or hidden it to the museum storage, or to make it be forgotten in the general public and in the society, or to use it to positive didactic purposes. And I believe that the history of collections entangled with colonial past could be said publicly in museums and outside museums, mostly in order to say that Poland was not an innocent eternal victims. We were victims many times for many perpetrators, but we also are implicated by this second-hand colonialism. And I believe it will be better for, it's like in your project, remembering for social justice for all parties involved, for all stakeholders, it will be better to tell the truth publicly.
Okay, I see that on the chat there is exchange of messages. Paul shared some information about road collection, and Hilary also wrote something, so perhaps you would like to make a comment.
I don't think I had anything very intelligent to share via the chat. I can't access the public chat, so I don't know if anybody's posting questions or comments into that. I did have another question, sort of a question for you all, particularly in Poland, and thank you for your presentations. I found them really fascinating, really helpful to understand aspects of Klaatsch's activities better that I didn't understand, and the post-Klaatsch history of the collection. But I don't really have a very good understanding of Polish history, and I wonder whether people in Poland feel that they have a colonial past, that they were colonized in the past by the German Empire, by the Russian Empire, whether there's some commonalities or some similarities in that sense.
Okay, so briefly, I'm not a historian, but to my knowledge, historians were in recent years working on this like double position of Poland in this complex colonial global matrix. So on the one hand, Poland was perceived as a colonized by neighboring empires. So also German historians like Jürgen Zimmerer, he wrote a lot about the Second World War period, German occupation, and he was comparing it to history of colonies in German colonies in Africa. And of course, the period of partitions of Poland between Are you with us? Okay, I can see Hilary. So this is something called European internal colonization. For some empires, it was like a compensation for not having overseas colonies. That's the one thing. And also, I think that the discussion was somehow intensified after the Russian invasion in Ukraine. We were all thinking more about our Polish-Ukrainian history that is somehow also described with these colonial categories, the politics of Poland in early modern era towards Ukraine, but also Belarus, the Western Belarus, for example, and that is described in these terms. So that's one aspect, is being colonized, the other colonizing neighboring countries and nations. And also there is like this colonial desire in the 19th century. This is something I was working on in the context of the history of State Ethnographic Museum in Warsaw. The beginning of this museum, it starts actually with something that was called First Polish African Expedition. So they went from the, let's say, colonized country to Africa to establish Polish colony in Cameroon. And some objects were brought to Warsaw and to Krakow, and two ethnographic museums were actually established after bringing these ethnographic collections from Africa to Polish cities. And yeah, so that was a kind of desire that was continued in between war period, and also, to my knowledge and my research, after the Second World War in 50s, Polish travelers, ethnographers, people who were going to African socialist countries were somehow repeating the patterns of behavior of 19th century explorers. So that's very interesting, that there was also a kind of colonial imaginary in a country that could not have overseas colonies because due to political circumstances, basically. And if you ask me about the common knowledge in Polish society, I don't think it's very popular. I don't think that many people perceive Poland in this Polish history in these colonial categories. Perhaps we would rather describe ourselves as colonized by Germany and Russia. Not sure if in Polish society people would admit that we were colonizing actively, or at least trying to colonize. That's my opinion.
Well, that's very interesting.
If I can add something, because I totally agree, and also the way you present it is something important, that it's, on the one hand, there are some analogies between the Poland situaedness compared with former colonies, but also is this global entanglements between Poland, Polish territories, Polish society, and the global matrix of power. But to make it more complicated, maybe a little bit, after the war, after the Second World War, those travelers going to Africa officially came with the state propaganda, communist propaganda, that we were anti-capitalistic, anti-imperial, anti-colonial ones, but nevertheless, still these enterprises, these activities somehow repeated the former colonial patterns of thinking about ourselves, about others, about what should be done and what shouldn't. What's more, even yesterday during the public debate on sensitive heritage on Wrocław exhibitions, we came to the point that maybe the way we gained former German territories after the Second World War upon the decision of policymakers in Yalta and Potsdam was also a kind of colonization, this time Polish colonization on former German lands. So it's also one of the dimensions of this complex issue.
This is something I would like to call Polish colonial complex. And I think for me, I mean, from my position, it's easier to make a research on museums because, well, you don't need to have this history of overseas colonies to have a purely colonial museum institution in central cities of Poland, because these patterns were repeated, and it was a kind of inferiority complex, and that's why some patterns from the Western museums and Western ethnography, in case of Poland, mostly German ethnography and British ethnography, that were two main sources, they were just repeated. So that's interesting in case of museums.
If I can add a little historical fact from around 1918, the end of the Great War. The Europe is exhausted by the Great War, but for Poland is the opportunity for gaining independence after the partitions time in 19th century. And in this specific moment, historical moment, Poland was exactly on this, let's say, crossings or two ways, clash of two ways of thinking about ourselves. Because after the First World War, Germany had to leave their colonies outside Europe, and also gave back some territories to Polish state. And Polish state ambitions were also to take part in these partitions of former German colonies outside Europe. So not to be treated only as one of the former colonies of Germany, but also as one of the new modern colonizers. And if we have ambitions or had ambitions to in interwar period or just after the First World War to be a regional power in Europe, there was a thinking that we need our own colonies.
Okay, we have last 10 minutes of the discussion, so perhaps we should pass by the microphone to our public. Are there any questions you would like to? Oh yeah, there is a question.
My name is Jędrzej Siut. I am from the Forensic Medicine Museum in Wrocław. Maybe I don't have got the question, but a short comment. One thing we told already yesterday during the debate, that the problem of decolonization of the museums in Poland is of course very important, but the decolonization should be made in a clever way. Destroying of the collections and sending back the specimens to the country of their origin is not the thing we should start from. We should start from speaking with the local communities. That's what our guests from Australia also confirmed in their lectures. But very often it will be much better, even for the local ethnic community, if this collection can be used in a new way, if we can rearrange completely the exhibition to show the problem of the colonialism, to show the suffering of the people which were the victims of the colonialism, to show now their culture, and to show this collection in a completely new way. Of course, every collection should be treated in a separate way. There are no two the same collections. So of course, if for the local community it would be for some reasons really important to get back the remains, of course we should give it back. But first we should speak, because much better for the museum, for the collection, and for the local community can be making completely new kind of the exhibition in the new way. So not only showing that as a typical anthropologic collection, for example, the skulls, yes, but also showing it as a sign of times, of the colonialism, of the suffering of the people in Australia. And maybe this is the way in which we should start to think about the recolonization. That's my comment. Thank you.
I think one thing more, Joanna Szlagam from Jagiellonian University Museum. I observed this discussion for a long time, and I really, all the time, I'm focused on Australian cases and American. And of course, we are not, as museums, not so open for decolonization or for this kind of discussions. And maybe in Poland, we are not so aware of the problematic. But discussions are really often now at the moment. The problem that our colleague said is also important in another case, from another perspective. We need to have some state regulations or state support, because as universities and as museums, mostly public institutions, we are not able to sometimes react alone, not in the sense of the object itself sometimes, but all other procedures that we should organize and pay, for example. And even if it's so sensitive object is wrong word, and I didn't find really good case how we can speak about human remains. It's not about objects, but in the sense of Polish law and Polish procedures in different institutions, we need to treat human remains or different things connected with human as objects, because in this way we can protect them really good. But at the same moment, if we protect, then we have some procedures, and without state awareness, without state steps and support, it will be never good enough to speak with any community or any problematic issues. So we need to have really big awareness on state level, and then after together realize. So that is why I think the countries and institutions that are after this kind of proceeding, it's important to catch some things and to inform maybe our ministries, because it's not for one ministry, it's more than one sector, but it's definitely really important issue to discuss with people that are responsible for the way how we think about this kind of collections, because in individual process, I have this kind of experiences, not without remains, but another object which was not in the perfect and good way in ownership of one of public institutions. We are alone inside, and it's not recognizable for everyone else. So that is why it's still wrong situation, because it's not. So we cannot exchange this importance of this process, yeah, because it's important to be aware, it's important to be in contact, in dialogue, but if you are alone, then you are alone, yeah. So that is a big problem, I think, definitely not only in our country, but in these situations. Thank you.
Yes, I would agree.
Well, thank you very much for both your comments, and I do agree. And we had the same problem in Germany. The example are the Benin bronzes, and it needed the state cultural minister who said, okay, we do this now. We return the Benin bronzes, and then we could in fact do it in practical terms. I mean, the items belong legally to the museum. Our museum in Mannheim belongs to the municipality or the city of Mannheim. So the council of the city of Mannheim had to talk about this in one of their court talks and make a decision. And then we as a museum were able to do the returns. Not done yet, but I agree with you that we need the legal and political framework, in fact, to support, to support all this. So it can happen, and it happened in the case of the Benin bronzes in Germany, and I'm sure it will happen in the other cases and other issues, and it will also happen probably in Poland, but it did happen in Germany. So. Well, that's a very important point for the practical work of museums and university collections.
I would also like to thank for these comments. As for the rearranging the exhibitions, I believe that we can say about colonialism and all this difficult past, but without showing any human remains. It's also an option. If we agree that we know for sure whose remains are and where should they belong to. And regarding the regulations, of course, it's a huge problem, not only on regard on the accession of museum objects in Poland, but also regarding the status of human remains in museums. The report I cited, the report by Emilia Jastrzębska about human remains in Polish museum sector, is the very first document to map the scope of the problem, but it is also showing very clearly how under-regulated this issue is in Polish museum sector. So the next steps are really needed.
Sorry, could I?
Anyone else would like to ask the question? We have still like 2 minutes.
I think Sarah wanted to make a comment, if we can.
Jan Kotusz, Museum of Natural History. I listen here, and probably I'm the only biologist here on this hall. And just to make things maybe more level on this. I would like to put the perspective of biologists, because we are just scientists that take the some materials just as our material for making science. I know it is somehow colonial thinking, but it somehow somehow explain our ignorance. Okay, it is. I know it. It is our ignorance of my environment, and this is why, for example, we miss such facts like missing localities. Yeah, Bobrowice Tower, no Bobrowice. So it is really our ignorance, because we are focused on something else. We don't care. Okay, I generalize maybe too much, but biologists do not care the provenance. Okay, this is something that we need to make science, and this is the point. Yeah, so this is also perspective, and this is just opportunistic, but also pragmatic point of view. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Paul and Sarah.
Just very quickly, no Indigenous community that I know of and have worked with over the past 40 plus years, God, it is nearly 40 years now, is against science. What they want is science which they play an active and controlling role in. It is the case now that there are numerous communities in Australia who are quite open to research using new genomic techniques, the analysis of DNA, but on their terms, after remains of individuals, of old people have gone home, then it's the community is willing to discuss, in a number of instances, research with scientists. But ultimately, the nature of that science, the questions to be asked, are those where Indigenous people are in control, not only of the scientific investigation of remains, but also the outcomes. That is, the data that may be used, may be produced in the process of that science. But I want to make that very, very clear. First Nation peoples in Australia are not anti-science. This is something which we really have to keep first and foremost in our minds. What they want is good science. They want ethical science, science which is basically answering the questions that they want answered, which is something that scientists have not done for over 2 centuries. By and large, the questions that they have asked, or the research that they have done, has been for their own academic interests and not for Indigenous people, even though they may claim at the end of the day that they are doing this in the long run to improve Indigenous understanding of health, etc., etc. That has not happened in the past. And this is why now it is important and vital in Australia and recognised that this research must be done under clear ethical guidelines which prioritise and recognise Aboriginal ownership and control of not only their past, but ultimately their bodies, their what are collections within museums. Those are the ethical frameworks that we now work with in Australia, and they should be adopted elsewhere.
Thank you. And Sarah, would you like to make a comment? We can't hear you. You need to unmute.
Sorry, let's go back to Grassy Museum and what Birgit Scheps did there. The first thing she did, as far as I understand it, well, this is how we were told, was that she reclassified the remains as humans. And by doing that, it changed the status of those, the remains in the museum. It turned them from objects into human beings. And under German law, or under the laws of Saxony, as far as I understood, they then had an obligation to return the objects, the remains, the people, to their country of origin. So she actually used the laws of the German state to to facilitate the process of the repatriation. Now, I don't know what the laws are in Poland, and they may not be the same. But I think, in answer to the guy who was talking about science, the importance of science, they're not objects, they're people, and they did belong to families. The colonial history of Australia is very shallow. It's only the colonial history of the Kimberley is not much over 100 years or so, 150 years. There are families who know who these, or who are connected, a couple of generations out to these people, and we know from the evidence that they were dug up, stolen, taken in illegal fashion. So it is a legal obligation of the state. And the museum, I guess, has to respond to their state laws, and the collections, I know, belong to the state or to the museum, but as a part of the state, like Mannheim. But they're of a different class, and that needs to be, I think if you use that as a way of facilitating a process, then it becomes, it's in a different realm, and it is part of the decolonisation of museums. So I really strongly recommend that if you get a chance to go to the Grassi Museum. It's the only museum I know that has promoted the story of the taking of human remains as being key to the process of decolonising their museum, and they've matched it with the way they've done it. They've turned the museum into a site of reconciliation, and it's ongoing. It's not to do with the past; it's to do with the present. Anyway, that's all I'd like to say. Thank you. I will say thank you for everything. It's been really good to be part of this discussion.
Thank you for your comment, and Hilary would like to add something.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the questions. I think it's important to hear people's voices. I completely agree with what's just been said, but I would also like to say, in response to the question or the comment about reorganising exhibitions or collections, I think what Sarah has said is a very good example of how a museum can create a space within the museum for a different sort of story. I was talking with colleagues earlier today about other museums that have created exhibitions about the repatriation process. So the Weltmuseum in Vienna, for example, I don't know if it's still there, but certainly the last time I visited, they had an exhibition about returning ancestors to New Zealand, to Maori and Moriori people. But I think, yes, I agree that these are questions that need to be clarified with the communities of origin, but I think it's very unlikely that you will find communities willing to say, yes, you can keep our ancestors if you need them for an exhibition to talk about colonial horrors. Because and I have to say, I'm hearing people's concerns and worries, but I haven't heard anything in this discussion that I haven't previously heard from another museum or another institution holding ancestral remains. And I know one of the big German museums raised basically that question, we can't return these because we need to illustrate our problematic past. In that case, it was the remains of Nazi victims. And I just don't think there's any way in the world that any museum now would still think that an appropriate response. We'll put the remains of Nazi victims on display. We'll show you the lamps made of human skin. So, I think maybe sometimes these comparisons are helpful to give a bit of perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this important comment. Are there more questions from our audience? Łukasz, Corinna, would you like to add something?
Probably people want their lunch.
Do we have any questions in a chat from
I don't
online
have a
audience?
specific comment, but or question, but I think it's been just great to talk together and exchange views with you in Poland, with the colleagues in Australia, and it's really great and a great inspiration for my work. And I would like to also add that in Mannheim we are open for cooperation, sharing the documents where they are needed. So I would like to say that officially from our museum.
Thank you very much for all the speakers and all the voices from the audience. My final remark would be that I hope it is not the end of the debate, but rather the beginning. And also, we have a limited time. I think it's high time to make the repatriation of ancestors from the Klaatsch collections, which are still in Wrocław. And in 2027, there will be 120 anniversary of Hermann Klaatsch being appointed to the cathedral at the University of Wrocław. So we have still around 2 years to make it happen. Maybe within these 2 years, to plan the agenda for the next year, following 2 years. And international, interdisciplinary, trans-institutional cooperation also with policymakers could make it happen to make a repatriation of human remains from Wrocław Klaatsch collections.
Conference.
Maybe we should think about it. Cooperation between Wrocław and Warsaw, I think, could help for that. But we should also think not only in terms of anniversaries, but long processes. I think that Corinna was right. If we want to start something, we shouldn't only wait for the change of law and authorities. We should start research. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and sometimes funding, resources that we need to find for that. So it's the beginning of the process, of course, establishing relationships with communities of implication. And as Sarah said, perhaps we should also read our laws, because to my knowledge, in the burial law in Poland, nobody, no institution and no man can possess any human remains. So there is also like a kind of contradiction between our laws. The museum law says that everything that is in our inventory is possession of in the possession of the museum. But on the other hand, the burial law says that nobody can possess human, nobody, no institution and no individual can possess human remains. So there is something that we can work on before things will change from the perspective of our authorities. Thank you for this interesting exchange. Thank you for your attention. And now we have a lunch break. Thank you very much.